You need to leave." Martha Kingsley's voice did not shake, though every muscle in her body was trembling beneath her calico dress. She stood in the doorway of her farmhouse, the late afternoon sun cutting hard across the Kansas plains behind her, and she pointed her finger at the man sitting at her kitchen table as though she could physically remove him with sheer force of will. Theodore Maddox did not move. He sat with both hands flat on the worn pine surface, his dark eyes steady, his jaw set in that infuriating way he had that made her want to throw something ceramic at his head. There was a bruise forming along his left cheekbone and dried blood at the corner of his mouth, and he had clearly ridden hard to get here, because his horse outside was still breathing heavy and flecked with foam. "Martha," he said, and just the sound of her name in his mouth made her chest ache with a fury she could not fully distinguish from longing. "Do not say my name like that," she snapped. "Do not sit there at my table and say my name like you have any right to it after what I found out today." He did not look away from her. "What did you find out?" she laughed, and the sound was sharp and ugly. "What did I find out? You want me to say it out loud?" She stepped into the kitchen and slammed the folded paper down on the table in front of him. The letter that had arrived that morning via a writer from Dodge City. The letter that had unraveled every single thing she thought she knew about the man who had walked onto her land 4 weeks ago and quietly, without a word of explanation, begun fixing her fence. His eyes dropped to the paper. He read it. His expression did not change, but she saw his hands press harder against the table. "It is not what you think," he said. "It says your real name, Theodore. It says what you ran from. It says why you came here." Her voice finally cracked on that last word, and she hated herself for it. "It says you are a wanted man. It says you killed someone." The silence between them stretched so long and so taut it felt like a wire about to snap. And then Theodore Maddox looked up at her, and the expression in his eyes was not the guilt she expected, not the defiance she feared, but something raw and grieving and terrifyingly honest. "I did not kill him," he said quietly, "but I know who did, and that is the most dangerous secret I have ever carried." Martha stared at him. Outside, a hawk circled lazily over the dry grass. Her heart was hammering so loud she was certain he could hear it. "Then you had better start talking," she said, and he did. It had begun 4 weeks earlier, on the kind of morning in September of 1879, when the sky over the Kansas plains stretched wide and pale as bleached bone, and the air smelled faintly of dust and coming rain. Martha Kingsley had been up since before dawn, as she always was, because the Kingsley homestead did not run itself, and had not run itself for the 2 years since her husband Robert had died of a fever that moved through him fast and merciless and left her with 90 acres, a milk cow, 4 laying hens, a mule named Consequence, and a grief that she had mostly packed into a box in the back of her chest and sat on hard enough to keep it closed. She was 31 years old. She had strong hands and a straight back, and a face that people called handsome rather than pretty, with brown eyes that noticed things and dark hair she kept pinned up because loose hair was impractical, and Martha Kingsley was, above all things, a practical woman. She had been a practical woman since she was 14 years old, when her mother died in Missouri, and she had taken over running the household for her father and 3 brothers. And she had been a practical woman when she agreed to marry Robert Kingsley at 22, because he was decent and steady, and the land he'd homesteaded in Kansas was real and solid in a way that seemed to promise permanence. Robert had been a good man. She had loved him in a real and quiet way, and she missed him still, though the missing had changed from a sharp wound to a dull, persistent ache, the way a broken bone that healed slightly wrong sometimes reminded you of itself in cold weather. What Robert had left behind, besides the land, was a half-finished fence along the northern pasture boundary and a set of unpaid debts to the general merchant in Calico Creek, the nearest town, 4 miles east. He had also left behind a dispute with the neighboring rancher, a man named Gerald Vance, over the exact placement of that northern fence line. Vance ran cattle, 300 head of longhorn that wandered freely, and seemed to have a particular attraction to Martha's pasture grass. And Vance had been nudging that boundary in increments for 2 years, each time with a smile that did not reach his cold gray eyes, and a suggestion that perhaps a widow woman might want to consider selling to someone who could put the land to better use. Martha had refused every time with the same direct politeness she applied to all unpleasant things, but Vance's last visit, 3 days before Theodore Maddox appeared on her horizon, had carried a harder edge. He had not raised his voice. He had simply let the silence after his offer sit long enough for her to understand that it was not entirely a friendly one. So that was the situation on the morning that she looked up from mending the bottom rail of the garden fence, her back aching and her patience thin, and saw a rider coming from the west. He was moving at a walking pace, which already said something, because men with urgent purposes or bad intentions generally came faster. He was riding a dark bay horse, well kept but trail dusty, and as he came closer she could see that he was lean and broad-shouldered, with a weathered canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He rode the way certain men did who had spent so many years on horseback that the animal and the man had achieved a kind of mutual understanding that was almost graceful. He stopped at the edge of her property. He looked at the fence line. Then he looked at her. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, standing up straight and looking at him with the clear, assessing gaze she gave every stranger, which was essentially a gaze that said, "I am not frightened of you, but I am paying close attention." "Any work available?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of work can you do?" "Most kinds," he said. It was not the most informative answer she had ever received. "I cannot pay much," she said. "The season's been hard." "I do not need much," he said. "A meal and a dry place to sleep is enough." She studied him another moment. He had a direct gaze, and he had not once let his eyes slide past her to inventory the farm in that calculating way some men did when they were looking for something other than honest work. She had learned to read men for certain warnings the way you learn to read the sky for weather. "The north fence needs mending," she said. 6 posts need replacing and about 40 yards of wire needs restringing. You can start there. Barn's got a tack room you can sleep in. Supper is at 6 and I expect you washed up beforehand." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Martha Kingsley," she said, not as an invitation but as an introduction, the way she always gave her name like a statement of fact. He paused the smallest beat, as though the name meant something to him, though she could not have said why she noticed that. "Theodore Maddox," he said, and that was how it started. He was not a talkative man, which suited her fine, because the farm had plenty of noise in it already, the wind and the animals and the creak of the house settling at night, and she had learned in her widowhood to appreciate silence as something that had texture to it rather than being simply the absence of sound. She watched him from the kitchen window on that first morning as he walked the fence line, examining each post, testing the wire, crouching down to look at the soil. He worked methodically and without wasted motion, and by noon he had already replaced 3 posts and had the wire restrung along 15 yards of it in a way that was noticeably straighter and tighter than what Robert had put up. She brought him water and cornbread at midday, which was her custom with hired hands. He took it with a quiet thanks and ate standing up, looking at the pasture. "You have done this kind of work before," she observed. "Some," he said. "Where are you from?" He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Various places," he said, which was not an answer, but she had asked it more as habit than as real curiosity, and she let it pass. In 1879 Kansas, drifters were as common as dust, and asking a man where he was from was frequently asking him to lie, since many men in that part of the country had come west specifically because of what they were leaving behind. She did not need his history to evaluate his fence work. His fence work was excellent. By the end of the first day, the north fence was entirely repaired, which would have taken Robert a full 2 days, and Robert had been a competent man. Theodore did it without fuss or announcement, and when he came to supper, he had washed his hands and face at the pump, and he sat at the table with his hat off and waited until she sat before he picked up his fork. She made salt pork and beans and corn cake, which was what she made most nights because it was filling and cheap, and she had enough of both. He ate everything on his plate without comment and helped himself to a second serving when she gestured at the pot, and she found herself obscurely pleased by this, since it indicated the food was good, and she had always been a woman who took quiet satisfaction in a meal being appreciated. "The south fence along the pasture edge also needs some attention," she said, without particularly meaning it to sound like an offer to extend his employment. He looked at her thoughtfully. "The gate post is cracked," he said. "I noticed it when I came in. It will give out before winter if it is not replaced." She hadn't known that. She felt a small, involuntary prick of something that was not quite embarrassment but was adjacent to it. "Thank you," she said. After supper, he went to the tack room in the barn, and she cleared the plates and stood at the window for a while looking out at the dark prairie. There was a half-moon rising and the grass made silver waves in the wind, and somewhere far off a coyote said something brief and melancholy to the night. She thought about practical things, about the winter supply list and the loose shingle on the east side of the roof, and whether the milk cow was going off her feed. She was good at thinking about practical things. She was not as good at other things, but she was not going to think about those. The next morning Theodore was up before her, which she discovered when she came out to the yard at 5:30 to pump water, and found him already at the gate post, measuring the crack with his hands. She stood and watched him for a moment in the cool gray light, and something struck her then that she filed away without examining, which was that having another person present in the early morning on the farm changed the quality of the silence in a way that was not unpleasant. "There is coffee when you want it," she said. "Thank you," he said, not looking up from the post. He fixed the gate post that morning, and then, entirely without being asked, climbed up onto the barn roof in the afternoon and replaced 3 rotting shingles. She came out to tell him she had not asked him to do that and found him already back on the ground, sweeping the old shingle debris into a pile. "It was letting water in," he said simply. She looked at the roof. The patch job was clean and even. She looked back at him. "What do you want for it?" she asked, because she was not a woman who accepted things without understanding the cost. He looked at her with a faint expression she could not quite categorize. "Nothing," he said. "It needed doing." She held his gaze for a moment and then she said, "Supper is at 6, and went back inside. And if she moved through the kitchen a little more briskly than usual, it was simply because there was a great deal to do. Over the following days, something settled between them that was not friendship exactly, but had some of its properties. The way two people who work near each other begin to develop a kind of peripheral awareness, a sense of where the other person is, a calibration of their moods. She noticed that Theodore was watchful in the way of a man who had learned that the world could change quickly and wanted advance warning, and that he was almost constitutionally averse to complaint or unnecessary speech, and that he had a particular attentiveness when she spoke that made her feel, when she said something, that it had actually been heard. She also noticed, with the clinical detachment she applied to most things, that he was a physically striking man, the kind that would turn heads in town not because of any softness or prettiness, but because of something in the way he occupied space, a quiet gravity that made you aware of him. She noticed this the way she might notice that a horse was a particularly good-looking animal, as a simple fact she registered and then set aside. On the 5th day, he repaired the door on the chicken coop, which had been hanging wrong on its hinge, and letting in drafts that Martha suspected were affecting the egg production. She found him at it in the late afternoon and she watched him work for a while before she spoke. "You keep fixing things I have not asked you to fix," she said. He looked up at her and something almost like amusement moved across his face, though it did not become a smile. "Would you prefer I did not?" She thought about it honestly, which was her habit. "No," she said, "but I want to understand your reasoning." "A farm that is not kept up falls apart," he said. "Things compound." A loose hinge becomes a broken door, becomes a gap that lets in predators. I cannot see a thing that needs doing and leave it undone. She looked at him steadily. That sounds like something that comes from experience. Something shifted in his expression. It does, he said quietly, and did not elaborate, and she did not push, because she recognized the particular quality of that closed door. On the 7th day she rode into Calico Creek for her weekly supplies, and she mentioned to Eliza Perkins, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone within 40 miles, that she had a hired hand. Eliza raised her eyebrows. "What is his name?" "Theodore Maddox," Martha said, examining a bolt of flannel. Eliza was quiet for a moment in a way that Martha noticed. "I have not heard that name," Eliza said carefully. Martha looked at her. "That is a strange way to respond." "I only meant I do not know him," Eliza said, and busied herself with the ledger. Martha did not press it, but she thought about it on the 4-mile ride home, the way Eliza had gone quiet at the name, the small shift in her usual warmth, and she filed it away in the back of her mind with the other small notations she had been making about Theodore Maddox. That evening, over supper, she said, "How long do you plan to stay?" He looked at her across the table. "As long as the work lasts," he said. "There is always work on a farm," she said. "Then as long as I am useful," he said. She took a sip of coffee and looked at the window where the dark had settled in. "And what were you doing before this?" she asked, not pushing, just asking, leaving the door open. A long pause. He was not a man who filled silence with noise. "Moving," he said finally. "From what?" The pause was longer this time. "From a situation that had become complicated," he said. She nodded slowly. "A great many men come west because of complicated situations," she said, without judgment. He looked at her with those dark eyes. "You are not curious." "I am very curious," she said. "But I am also aware that curiosity does not obligate you to honesty, and I would rather have no answer than a convenient lie." He was quiet a moment, and then he said, "That is one of the most honest things anyone has said to me in a long time." She looked at him steadily. "I try to be honest about most things." "Most things," she almost smiled. "There are some things it is more comfortable not to be honest about." "Such as?" She looked back at the window. "Such as whether you are lonely," she said, and was surprised by her own words the moment they were out, because she had not meant to say that, had not planned to say that. It had simply risen up from wherever she kept the things she did not examine and come out of her mouth before she could stop it. The silence after that was different from the other silences. Warmer, somehow. "Yes," Theodore said. "That is one of those things." She nodded and stood up and began clearing the plates, and they did not speak again that evening. But something had changed in the space between them, the way weather changes the air before a storm, that charged and particular aliveness. On the 10th day Gerald Vance came to call. Martha saw his horse before she saw him, a big roan that Vance favored, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that Vance's visits produced. She was in the garden when he rode up, and she stood and brushed the soil from her hands and watched him dismount with the calm exterior she maintained for difficult things. "Martha," Vance said. In the jovial way he had that was not truly jovial. He was a big man, broad and red-faced, in his mid-50s, with a thick mustache and the self-satisfied air of a man who had accumulated enough land and money to believe that those things constituted a personality. "I was passing by." "You are never just passing by, Gerald," she said pleasantly. He laughed, a big sound that filled up space. "I heard you took on a hand," he said, looking around. "I did," she said. His eyes landed on Theodore, who had appeared at the barn door and was standing there watching, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and nothing readable on his face. Something passed across Vance's expression. It was there and gone so quickly Martha almost missed it, but she had been paying very close attention to Gerald Vance for 2 years, and she had learned to catch those fast, unguarded moments. It was recognition, she thought, or something very like it. New in the area. Vance said, still looking at Theodore. "Hired help," Martha said, deliberately not answering the question he'd actually asked. Vance looked back at her. "I came to say that my offer still stands," he said with slightly less joviality than before, "on the property. And I want you to know, Martha, that I say this as a man who has your best interests at heart. Winter is coming and this farm is a lot for a woman alone." "I am not alone," she said. "I have hired help." Vance's eyes went to Theodore again. "Drifters move on," he said. "So do conversations that are going nowhere," she said. "Thank you for calling, Gerald." His smile went fixed. He was not accustomed to being dismissed by a widow woman in calico, and they both knew it. "I'll be back," he said, in a way that was not quite a threat but wore threat's clothes. "You usually are," she said, and held his gaze until he mounted and rode away. She turned and Theodore was walking toward her across the yard, and something about the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried but with a particular attention, made her think of a man who had positioned himself between a potential danger and something he meant to protect. "You know him," she said when he reached her. It was not a question. He met her eyes. "I have seen men like him," he said, which was either evasion or something more careful than a direct answer. "He recognized you," she said, a beat of silence. "I am not sure," he said. "Perhaps." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came across the grass and lifted a strand of her hair that had escaped its pin. "Is there something I should know?" she asked. He held her gaze and she saw the calculation in his eyes, not a dishonest calculation but a careful one, a man weighing what he could say against what it would cost. "Not yet," he said finally. She might have pushed then. She felt the urge to. But she also understood that there were things a person could not be made to share before they were ready to share them, and that pressing before that moment arrived usually produced lies rather than truth. So she only said, "When you are ready," and walked back to the garden. She did not look at his face, but she thought she heard him exhale. By the second week something had shifted so far from what Martha had intended this arrangement to be that she was spending considerably more time than she should have thinking about it. It was not, she told herself firmly, anything romantic. She was a practical woman, and he was a drifter with secrets, and she was 31 years old and she had been a widow for 2 years and her world was this farm and this land, and the practicalities of keeping both alive through another Kansas winter. But she found herself setting the supper table with care instead of expediency. She found herself brushing her hair an extra time before she pinned it up in the morning. She found herself listening during the day for the sounds of his work, the ring of a hammer or the sound of fence wire being strained taut, in a way that was attentive beyond simply knowing where her hired hand was. And she found that the evenings, which she had spent for 2 years reading or mending in silence broken only by the wind and the occasional animal, had become the best part of her day. They did not talk constantly, but they talked, and the quality of his attention when she spoke and the rare, unexpected things he said when he did speak were like water to a thirst she had not admitted to having. On the 14th day he fixed the pump handle which had been difficult to operate since spring, and she came out and worked it and felt the smooth, clean motion of it, and then she turned and looked at him with an expression she had not fully planned. "Theodore," she said. "Martha," he said. They looked at each other for a long moment in the bright afternoon light, and something that had been building between them for 2 weeks sat right there in the air between them, visible and substantial as the farmhouse behind her. "Why did you really come here?" she asked. "Not to this farm, to Calico Creek." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the worn wrench he'd used on the pump and turned it in his hands. "I needed somewhere quiet to think," he said. "About what?" He looked at the horizon, that habit of his, looking at distance when a question pressed close. "About what to do," he said, "with something I know." "Something dangerous," she said. He looked back at her. "Yes." "Is it dangerous to me?" she asked. "To this farm?" He held her gaze and she could see him choosing his words with great care. "It could become so," he said. "If certain people believed I was here and that you were important to me." She absorbed that. 2 things in it worth noting. 1, that he had acknowledged she was important to him, and 2, that he had confirmed what she suspected, which was that his past could reach her land. Then you should tell me what I am dealing with, she said. I should, he said. I know that. I am trying to determine how to do it without putting you in greater danger by knowing. I am more dangerous when I do not know things, she said, which was simply true. He looked at her and something moved across his face that she could only describe as tenderness, though it surprised her to use that word. I know, he said. Give me a little more time, she nodded once. And then, because she was a woman who understood the value of gesture, she said, supper tonight will be roast chicken. I killed the old hen. She had stopped laying. He blinked, recalibrating to this shift. That sounds good, he said. Yes, she said, it does. On the 16th day he kissed her, it was not planned. She was almost certain it was not planned, because when it happened, his expression immediately afterward carried the particular look of a man who has done something that surprised himself. It happened in the barn, of all places, the most unromantic of settings, because she had gone in to check on the milk cow who seemed off her feed, and he was there repairing a crack in the stall wall, and they were standing very close together looking at the same cow when she turned to say something about the cow's water supply, and found his face much nearer than she had expected. She did not step back. She did not know exactly why she did not step back, except that something in her had ceased in the past 16 days to want to create distance. He kissed her once, briefly, carefully, and then pulled back and looked at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen from him before, almost vulnerable. I apologize, he said immediately. That was not, do not apologize for it, she said, which surprised them both. He went very still. She felt heat in her face, and she turned back to the cow. She is not drinking enough, she said about the cow, and she heard him let out a slow breath, and then he was beside her looking at the cow's water trough, and neither of them mentioned the kiss again that evening. But she thought about it. She thought about it with the kind of focused attention she usually applied to supply lists and weather patterns, which was to say very carefully and without sentimental softening. She was a widow. She was alone. She had been alone for 2 years, and the loneliness of the farm was a real and physical thing that she had handled by being busy. He was a drifter with an unspecified dark past and secrets he had not yet shared, and a reason to move on that she could not know. These were the practical facts. The impractical fact was that when he had kissed her, she had felt, for the first time in 2 years, the sensation of being entirely present in her own body. On the 19th day, Eliza Perkins came to call, which was unusual enough that Martha came to the door with a concerned expression, because Eliza rarely left the store. I came because I did not want to say it in town, Eliza said, on the porch, with her hands folded and her expression apologetic. Say what? Martha asked, though the cold feeling starting in her sternum suggested she already knew the category of thing this was about. The man you hired, Eliza said carefully, Theodore Maddox. My husband got a letter last week from his cousin in Dodge City, who is a deputy there. There is a warrant out for a man by that name, for murder. Martha stood very still. The September wind moved through the yard. Murder, she said quietly. I am so sorry, Eliza said. I know you are alone out here and you cannot afford to be. Thank you, Eliza, Martha said. I appreciate you telling me. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She held the information the way you hold something very hot, carefully, with awareness of how much it could burn you. Then Theodore came in from the field at noon, and she set a plate in front of him, and she watched him eat, and she thought about the way he moved, and the way he listened, and the way he had stood between her and Vance's implicit threat, and she thought about what kind of man kills in a way that gets a warrant written on him. She thought about it all afternoon. And then a writer came from town with a sealed letter, and she opened it and read it, and it was worse than she thought, or entirely different from what she thought. And by the time Theodore walked in for supper that evening, she was sitting at the table with the letter in front of her and the question ready, which brought them back to the moment they had started with. Theodore sat with his hands flat on the table and the letter in front of him, and Martha Kingsley standing across from him, saying, "Tell me everything." His name was Frank Alderman, Theodore said. He had not moved from his seat. His voice was level, the voice of a man who had rehearsed something many times in his head and was finally saying it out loud. He was a cattle broker in Wichita. He was also the man who arranged the fraudulent land transfer that took my family's property in Missouri when I was 17. My father never recovered from it. He died believing he had failed us. My mother lived with my uncle for the rest of her life. Martha sat down. She had not planned to, but her legs made the decision. That was your family's land. 3 generations of it, he said. My grandfather built the house. He paused. I spent 8 years finding proof of what aldermen did, not for revenge, for the record, for my father's name. And I found it, he said, 2 years ago, but alderman had connections in Wichita that made a legal case impossible. He had judges in his pocket. When I went to confront him with the evidence to demand he make it right, there was an argument. Theodore's jaw tightened. I left him alive. He was alive when I walked out of that room. But someone killed him that night, and I was the last person seen with him, and the warrant came 3 weeks later. Martha was very quiet. Who killed him? Theodore met her eyes. Gerald Vance, he said. Alderman was his partner in the land fraud scheme. There were others, not just my family's land, but dozens of families across Missouri and Kansas. When I showed up with evidence, Alderman panicked and contacted Vance. Vance could not afford for Alderman to be persuaded to talk, so he eliminated him and made sure the suspicion fell on me. Martha absorbed this. The pieces began to move in her mind with the clicking precision of a good lock. Vance. The land. The way Vance had looked at Theodore in the yard. The offer for her property. The incremental movement of the fence line. Vance is doing to me what he did to those other families, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Theodore said. He has been acquiring land from vulnerable homesteaders for at least 5 years. He uses pressure first. If that does not work, he manufactures legal problems. If that does not work, he stopped. If that does not work, he finds another method, she said. Yes, she sat with this. A man with a dark past, a secret powerful enough to destroy him. A betrayal that had taken everything from his family, and a woman whose land sat between what Vance had and what Vance wanted. You came here specifically, she said slowly. You did not come to Calico Creek by accident. A pause. No, she looked at him. You came because you knew about my land, about Vance's interest in it. I came because I was tracking Vance, he said. I had evidence of what he did to my family and to Alderman, but I needed more. I needed him to make a move I could document. Your land is the last piece he needs to control the entire creek water supply for this part of the county. I knew he was pressing you. I thought if I was here, you thought you could catch him in the act, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, and I told myself it was just strategy, that staying here was just useful. He paused, and the careful distance he usually kept in his expression was entirely gone. Martha, I need you to know that whatever I told myself in the beginning, it is not only strategy anymore. It has not been strategy for a long time. What I feel when I am here, when I am with you, is not something I planned, and I am not certain I know what to do with it. The word forbidden came to her unbidden, though she could not say why. There was nothing forbidden in what he was describing, not truly, and yet the weight of it pressed on her the way forbidden things always did, with that particular combination of gravity and pull. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said. I was afraid. Of what? That you would send me away, he said simply. Before I had done what I came to do, before he stopped, before I was ready to leave. She looked at him for a very long time. The lamp on the table threw warm gold light across his face, and she could see the bruise on his cheek and the dried blood at his mouth, and she thought, where did he get those? What happened to your face? She asked. He touched the bruise reflexively. I rode to town today while you were in the South Field. I went to look at the county land records. I was recording information about the title transfers Vance has been engineering. One of his men caught me at it. There were 2 of them. She stood up and went to the shelf where she kept the medicine supplies, the iodine and the clean cotton, the simple tools of frontier first aid. She came back to the table and she stood before him and she said, "This is going to sting." and she pressed the iodine-soaked cotton to the cut at his mouth. He did not flinch. He sat very still, and she was close to him, closer than she had been except for that one moment in the barn, and she could feel the warmth coming off him and see the way he was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes. "I am not sending you away," she said quietly, concentrating on the cut. "Martha, I am not sending you away," she said again, more firmly, "but you are going to tell me everything from here forward. Every piece of the plan, every step, every risk. No hidden motives and no protective silences. Do you understand me?" "Yes," he said. "Because this is my land," she said, "and my fight. And I have been fighting it alone for 2 years, and I am very tired of doing it alone, but if I am going to have a partner in this, I need it to be a real one and not someone who feeds me only the parts he thinks are safe for me to know." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." She pressed the cotton a little harder than necessary. "Flattery does not change the terms," she said, but she felt warmth rise in her face, and she thought she saw something warm move through his expression too, something that was almost peace. "I understand the terms," he said, "and I agree to them." She finished cleaning the cut. She stepped back. She looked at him. "Then let us make a plan," she said. What followed was the most unusual 2 weeks of Martha Kingsley's life, and she had lived a life that contained several unusual periods, including the 6 months after Robert died when she had run the farm entirely by herself, while simultaneously grieving and learning 3 things she had not known how to do before. She and Theodore sat together at the kitchen table every evening, and he told her everything he knew about Vance's operation, which was considerable. He had the documentation from the county records he had managed to copy before Vance's men found him, and he had letters from some of the families who had lost land to Vance's scheme, and he had the original document connecting Alderman and Vance to the fraudulent transfer of his family's Missouri property. What they needed was testimony. Written and witnessed testimony from enough people that a federal judge, one outside Vance's sphere of influence, would have no choice but to act. The Kansas land fraud cases were serious enough, if properly documented, to draw federal involvement, which was their best hope, because the local judiciary in Calico Creek County was, as Theodore had suspected and Martha had begun to notice, compromised. Martha wrote letters. She wrote them in her clear, steady hand to the families on Theodore's list. Carefully worded letters that explained the situation without naming Vance directly. Letters that invited anyone who had experienced similar pressures to share their experience and potentially provide testimony. She sent them through Eliza Perkins, because whatever caution Eliza had shown about Theodore's name, she was an honest woman who had her own discomfort with Gerald Vance and could be trusted with mail. Theodore, meanwhile, rode the county. He was careful and he was patient, and he talked to men who had been bought out or frightened out, and some of them would not talk because fear had calcified in them past the point of movement, but some of them did. An old homesteader named Josiah Webb, who had lost his creek water rights 3 years ago. A young Mexican farmer named Emilio Reyes, whose property had been tangled in a false lien that forced him to sell at half value. A widow north of Calico Creek named Clara Hurst, who had received the same visits from Vance that Martha had, and unlike Martha had eventually sold, and now lived in town in 2 rented rooms and looked at Martha with eyes full of something raw and complicated when Martha came to see her. "I should have held on," Clara said. "You had no one to hold on with," Martha said gently. "That is not weakness, that is arithmetic." They spent evenings working through the documents, and somewhere in those evenings, amid the lamp light and the papers and the cups of strong coffee, the thing between them continued to grow in the quiet and insistent way that real things grow, the way a plant grows through solid stone given enough time and enough need. He told her about Missouri, about the house his grandfather built with his own hands from timber he cut himself, about the way the spring light came through the kitchen windows, in a way his mother had said was worth any hardship to live with, about his father in the years after the loss, a man diminished, not broken entirely but reduced, like a good lamp with less oil. She told him about her mother dying when she was 14 and how she had become, almost overnight, something more like a small adult than a child, and how she had carried that responsibility with a kind of fierce pride that sometimes felt indistinguishable from grief. She told him about Robert, too, honestly, in the way she talked about most things. That he had been good and that she had loved him, and that what she had felt for Robert was real, but also quieter than she had expected love to feel, more like a steady fire than the kind of light that filled a room, and that she had always assumed that was simply what love was, until it occurred to her more recently that perhaps it was what love was when it was not the love that fit you most precisely. She did not say who she was comparing Robert's love to. She did not have to. Theodore sat across the table from her and looked at her with those dark eyes and said nothing, and said everything. On a Thursday in the fourth week, when October had come, and the mornings had that knife-edge chill that meant winter was thinking about arriving, they had what they needed. 11 signed testimonials, Theodore's original documents, county land records showing the pattern of Vance's acquisitions. A letter from a lawyer in Topeka who had been recommended by Emilio Reyes's brother and who dealt in federal land cases and who, when Theodore had ridden to see him, had gone very still reading the file and then said, "This man has been operating for over 10 years. I have been waiting for someone to bring me this." The lawyer's name was Samuel Trent, and he was coming to Calico Creek on Saturday to take possession of the evidence. On Friday afternoon, with one day left before everything changed, Gerald Vance came with 4 men. Martha saw them from the garden and she felt something crystallize in her chest, cold and clear as ice. She had known this was a possibility. She had known it the moment Theodore told her about Vance's pattern, that if Vance sensed the trap closing he might move to remove the pieces before it snapped shut. She had prepared for it, or she had told herself she had, but seeing it happen was different from anticipating it. She walked into the house and picked up the rifle from behind the door, the Winchester 1876 that Robert had bought the year before he died, and that she had learned to use efficiently if not expertly, and she walked back onto the porch. Theodore appeared from the barn at a run, and she felt something fierce and grateful in her chest at the sight of him, because she had not needed to call for him. He had simply appeared. He came to stand at the base of the porch steps, not in front of her but beside her, slightly to her left, and she noted with appreciation that he understood she was not a woman who wanted to be stood in front of. Vance pulled his horse up at the yard's edge. His 4 men ranged behind him. He looked at the rifle in her hands and at Theodore beside her, and his expression was not surprised exactly, but it had lost the performance of joviality it usually wore. "Martha," he said, "I have come to make you a final offer." "You should not have brought 4 men to deliver an offer," she said pleasantly. "Times are uncertain," Vance said. He was looking at Theodore more than at her. "You," he said, with a particular coldness that stripped away all the social pretense, "I know what you have been doing." "I expect you do," Theodore said, in a voice so quiet and level it was almost remarkable. "Whatever you think you have gathered is meaningless," Vance said. "You are a wanted man, a murderer, who is going to listen to a murderer." "A federal judge might," Theodore said, "particularly with 11 corroborating testimonies and a lawyer in Topeka who is very interested in your land acquisition practices." Silence. Martha felt Vance recalculate, saw it in his face, the rapid internal arithmetic of a man who had always controlled the variables and was suddenly confronted with several he had not predicted. "You have nothing," Vance said, but his voice had changed. "We have everything," Martha said, "and a federal officer of the court arriving in Calico Creek tomorrow morning, who will, among other things, be filing for a review of the warrant outstanding against Theodore Maddox, based on new evidence regarding the death of Frank Alderman." She met Vance's eyes. "Evidence that includes a witness who saw you enter Alderman's hotel room in Wichita on the night of his death." She had not known if that particular gamble was true until this moment. Theodore had told her there might be a witness, someone who had been in the hotel corridor, a chambermaid who had been afraid to come forward. He had told her he was not certain she would testify. They had included a letter from her in their documentation to Samuel Trent, but they had not known if it was solid. The way Vance's face went gray told her everything she needed to know. One of his men shifted in the saddle. Another looked sideways at Vance with the expression of a man whose loyalty is primarily financial and who is rapidly reviewing his accounts. "This is not finished," Vance said, but the sentence had no structure under it. "It is more finished than you know," Theodore said. "And if any of your men so much as thinks about reaching for iron on this property, the document package that Samuel Trent is holding in Topeka will be opened immediately and shared with every federal official in Kansas. That has already been arranged." That was true. They had arranged that Thursday night after the lawyer's visit as the last piece of their plan, a sealed package with a second copy of everything in Trent's office, with instructions. Vance sat on his horse for a long moment. Martha kept the rifle level and her expression neutral. Theodore stood at her left, entirely still, like a man who had reached the end of a long road and was content to let it resolve. And then Gerald Vance turned his horse and rode away, and his men followed him, and the yard was quiet except for the October wind moving through the dry grass. Martha lowered the rifle. She realized her arms were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the aftermath of sustained tension, the way you shake when a storm has passed. She stood there for a moment, letting it move through her. Theodore turned and looked at her. He stepped up onto the porch very close to her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, which was true. "Martha," he said, and his voice had that quality again, the one she did not know how to categorize, that warmth and gravity all at once. "Not yet," she said, because she needed to get to the other side of tomorrow before she could give any part of herself to the conversation she could feel coming, the one that was more important than any of this. He nodded. He understood. They went inside and made supper and ate it mostly in silence, but it was a different silence now, one that had been swept clean, like a room after a long-needed tidying. Samuel Trent arrived on Saturday morning on the 8:30 stage from Wichita, a compact, precise man of 40 in a good dark coat with a face that suggested he took no satisfaction in legal injustice whatsoever. He sat at Martha's kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a stack of papers, and he went through their documentation with the thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. "This will be sufficient," he said, after an hour. "More than sufficient. The warrant against you," he said to Theodore, "is likely to be vacated within the month once I present the chambermaid's affidavit and the timeline evidence. The case against Vance is going to take longer and it will require a federal grand jury, but the foundation is solid." "Will he be arrested?" Martha asked. "In due time," Trent said carefully. "These things are not immediate. I want to be honest with you about that. But yes. The weight of evidence here, particularly the pattern of land fraud combined with the murder connection, will be more than a federal court can ignore." Theodore nodded. Martha nodded. They exchanged a look across the table, quick and private, full of the particular communication of two people who have been through something together. Trent stayed through midday and took possession of all the documentation and left on the afternoon stage, and they stood in the yard watching the stage depart in its cloud of dust, and then they were alone on the farm with the October sun slanting low and golden across the fields. Martha sat down on the porch steps. She felt hollow in the way that comes after a long fight, not empty but spacious, as if the interior had been cleared of furniture. Theodore sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder was near hers. For a long time neither of them spoke. "What will you do now?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. The question had obvious geography to it, obvious implications, and she had asked it knowing that. "I do not know," he said honestly. I came here with a purpose, and the purpose is accomplished or close to accomplished. The shape of things after that is not something I have given much thought to. Have you ever stopped moving? She asked. No, he said. Not since Missouri. She looked at the fields. The corn had been harvested 2 weeks ago, and the stalks were cut, and the soil was that dark, rich autumn color, and the horizon was huge and open in the way that Kansas horizons always were, suggesting both freedom and exposure in equal measure. I am going to say something direct, she said, because I am a direct person and I do not know how to do this the other way. All right, he said, quietly, very still. I have been alone for 2 years, she said. And I had accepted that as the shape of my life going forward. This farm and this land and this particular kind of solitude that a person can build into a life if they are disciplined enough about it. I had accepted it. I was not miserable, she paused, but I was not what I might have been. He was very quiet beside her. You came here and you fixed my fence without being asked, she said. And then I asked you to fix other things and you did. And somewhere in the fixing you also managed to. She stopped, pressing for the right word with the precision she always pressed for it. To be an inconvenient development, he offered quietly, and she could hear in his voice that careful warmth he kept. Yes, she said, with something that was almost a laugh. An extremely inconvenient development. Martha, he said, and turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were very close together in the low autumn sun with the fields open around them and the farmhouse at their backs. Do not go, she said. Simple, direct, without decoration. Not because the fence needs minding or because Vance might still cause trouble or because the farm needs labor. Because I would like you to stay. Because the farm is quieter than I care for when you are not here. And because you are the first person in a very long time who has made me feel that my life is not yet entirely written. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes, and she could see everything he was feeling, or almost everything, more than she had ever seen in a man's face, and she thought, he does not know how to let himself have this. He has been moving for so long that stillness feels like a trap. I am a wanted man, he said. Or at least I was until last month, and legal processes take time, and my history is complicated, and I know all of that, she said. I have known all of that for some time. I asked you to stay anyway. He reached out and took her hand, which was resting on the step between them, and held it the way you hold something you are afraid to break. She turned her hand and held his back, and there was something in the solidity of that grip, the warmth of it, the deliberate choosing of it, that felt more momentous than anything else that had happened this week. I would like to stay, he said quietly. Good, she said. They sat there in the lowering afternoon until the chill of October began to deepen, and the first stars appeared at the eastern edge of the sky, and the farm settled around them with the sounds of evening, the cow shifting in the stall, the hens quieting for the night, the wind coming across the prairie with that clean, vast smell of grass and distance. Winter came to Calico Creek in November that year with a week of iron-gray skies, and then a blizzard that locked the roads for 4 days and packed snow up against the farmhouse door to waist height. They worked through it together with the practical efficiency of 2 people who had each spent years managing difficult things alone and found it considerably less difficult together. Theodore reinforced the barn and brought in extra feed and kept the water from freezing in the livestock troughs. And Martha cooked the kind of heavy, warming food that a winter kitchen was made for, and kept the fire, and kept accounts, and read in the evenings by lamplight with her feet tucked under her on the settle. During the blizzard there was not much to do but wait it out, and they sat by the fire in the evenings and talked in the way they had been talking since those first weeks, but with the deeper ease that had come from everything they had shared, the danger and the truth-telling and the gradual building of trust. He told her more about Missouri, about his childhood before the land loss, the way his father had taught him to read a field, and how his grandmother had kept a kitchen garden so large and so beautifully organized it had looked like a living map. She told him about what she had wanted before Robert in Kansas, a small, half-formed dream of something she could not quite name, something like being fully known by someone. "I think I am beginning to understand what that dream was," she said one evening, not looking at him, looking at the fire. She felt him turn to look at her. "What was it?" he said. She looked at him then, steadily in the firelight. "This," she said simply. He looked back at her with that expression she had come to know, the one that was all the things he contained and was only now learning to show. And he leaned forward and kissed her properly. Not the brief, careful kiss in the barn, but a full and decided one. And she kissed him back with the same decision. And outside, the blizzard moved over the plains, and the farmhouse held its ground, solid and warm, the way things hold their ground when they are built well. Samuel Trent wrote in December to say that the warrant against Theodore Maddox had been officially vacated. The chambermaid's affidavit, combined with a timeline analysis that demonstrated Theodore's physical impossibility of having committed the act at the established time, had been sufficient for the Wichita court. The federal case against Gerald Vance was proceeding, and Trent expected an indictment in the spring. In the meantime, he wrote, it might be advisable for the relevant parties to remain available for testimony. Theodore read the letter at the kitchen table with Martha beside him, and something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a kind of deep, slow easing, as though a tension held for years was finally releasing, the way a fist held so long it had forgotten it was a fist finally uncurled. He put the letter down on the table. He put his hands flat the way he had that night, but this time it was not tension, it was simply presence. "It is over," he said. "Most of it," she said. "The testimony still needs giving." "Yes," he said, "but the worst of it, the being hunted, the not being able to stop," he looked at her, "that part is over." She put her hand over his on the table, and he turned his palm up and held it. They sat like that for a while in the winter kitchen with the fire going and the letter that had just changed things sitting between them. "Theodore," she said. "Martha," he said, the way he always said her name, like it was the only word in the language that mattered. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to take time to think about it honestly before you answer. I do not want an answer given from gratitude or relief, or the particular feeling a person has when a great weight has just been lifted." He looked at her seriously, understanding her completely in the way he had come to understand her. "All right," he said. "This land is mine," she said. "It was Robert's and now it is mine, and it will be mine until I decide otherwise. That does not change regardless of anything else. But a farm of this size, worked well, is something more than one person can do alone through all its seasons and all its needs. And I have found," she paused, finding her way carefully, "that I do not want to do it alone anymore. Not only practically, not only because of the fence or the roof or the pump handle." She looked at him. "I want to build something with someone, something real and lasting. And you are the only person I have met since Robert died who makes me believe that that is possible." He held her gaze throughout all of this with that steady, deep attention. "I am asking you to marry me," she said, with the directness that was her defining characteristic, the directness that had gotten her through everything. "If that is something you want, if this is something you want." She gestured slightly, meaning the farm and the land and herself and all of it together. He was quiet for a long moment. Not hesitant, she thought, but arriving, like a man who has traveled a long distance and is just now understanding he has reached the place he was going to. "Yes," he said. "This is what I want. You are what I want." He paused. "I was not sure I was allowed to want things like this again after everything." "You are allowed," she said firmly. "I am hereby granting you permission." He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh like that without restraint, and she thought she would like to hear that sound every day for as long as she lived. "Then yes," he said again. "Yes, Martha Kingsley, I would like very much to marry you." They were married in March, when the snow had retreated and the first green was showing at the edge of the fields, in a small ceremony at the Calico Creek Church with Eliza Perkins and her husband, and a handful of the neighbors they had come to know through the difficult months as witnesses. Emilio Reyes came, and Josiah Webb, And Clara Hurst came with a gift of preserves she had made herself and embraced Martha with a fierceness that communicated everything she felt about second chances. The federal indictment of Gerald Vance came through in April. He was arrested by 2 federal marshals on a Tuesday morning at his ranch house and taken to Wichita, and the news went through Calico Creek like a clean wind. Theodore and Martha both provided written and then in-person testimony, traveling to Wichita in May on the stage, staying in a respectable hotel, and it was strange and particular to sit in a courtroom and say the true things about what had happened and have them received as truth rather than dismissed. Theodore gave his testimony about the fraudulent transfer of his family's Missouri land with a calm and precision that Martha sat in the gallery and watched with a full heart, because she could see what it cost him and what it gave him at once, the particular catharsis of the truth told publicly, in a room built for it, at last. Vance was convicted in June. Land fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Frank Alderman. He would not come back to Calico Creek. His ranch went into receivership, and eventually the lands he had taken improperly began, slowly, through the complicated processes of law, to move back toward resolution. Not all of the families would recover what they had lost. Some had moved on too far and the law was imperfect and slow. But Josiah Webb recovered his creek water rights, which he said was enough for him, and Emilio Reyes received a settlement that allowed him to buy a different piece of land and start again, and several other families were similarly helped. Martha watched all of this with the same clear attention she brought to everything, noticing both what was resolved and what was not, the ways justice was partial, and the ways it was still better than silence. "It is not enough," she said to Theodore one evening in June, sitting on the porch after supper with the long prairie dusk spreading golden across the fields. "No," he agreed. "It rarely is, but it is more than there was before." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had been doing since the winter, finding that she liked it, the simple physical comfort of it. "I know," she said. "I am not complaining, I am just naming it." "You are good at naming things," he said with the warmth that was always in his voice when he spoke to her. "You are learning," she said. "I am trying," he said. She smiled and looked at the horizon. The farm stretched out before them in the golden light, the repaired north fence standing straight and tight, the barn with its replaced shingles, the garden in its summer fullness, the gate that swung smooth on its new hinge, the pump that worked clean and easy now, all the things that had been mended. "Theodore," she said. "Martha," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for fixing the fence." He was quiet for a moment, and then she felt the warmth of his laugh more than heard it. "I had reasons," he said. "You had reasons," she agreed, "but the fence still needed fixing and you fixed it anyway. That is its own kind of thing." She felt him turn to look at her. "Are we talking about the fence?" She lifted her head and looked at him. "We are talking about a great many things," she said. "We are talking about showing up and doing what needs doing without being asked. We are talking about a man who walked onto a stranger's land and started making it better because he could not see a thing that needed doing and leave it undone. We are talking about," she paused, feeling the full weight of it, the wonder of how things connect, how a broken fence post and a dark secret and a terrible injustice and a woman's loneliness had converged into this porch and this evening and this particular warm golden light. "We are talking about how things work out sometimes," Theodore said quietly. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what we are talking about." He leaned down and kissed her temple, and she settled back against his shoulder, and the prairie evening moved slowly around them, full of birdsong and wind and the smell of summer grass. In the autumn of 1880, Martha told Theodore that they were expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning, directly and without preamble, which was her way. She watched his face while she told him, because watching his face had become one of her great pleasures, the way it showed things now that it had once kept hidden. What she saw was a particular kind of wonder. Not surprise, not alarm, not the complicated practical calculations she had half expected, but simple, clean wonder, as though something entirely improbable and entirely welcome had just been confirmed. He reached across the table and took her hands. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she let the silence be what it was. "I am very glad," he said finally. "So am I," she said. "Though the timing could have been planned better, we will need to add on to the house before spring." He laughed. She loved his laugh. She had told him this in those direct and honest conversations they had developed, that she loved his laugh and she loved his hands, and she loved the way he looked at horizons when he was thinking, and she loved the way he always, without fail, knew when she needed quiet and when she needed presence, which was the most specific kind of love, the love that knew you at your particular edges. He had told her things in return in his more careful and deliberate way, and the things he said were not less for being fewer. He had told her that she was the only place he had ever felt still. He had told her that she had given him back a future he had thought he lost. He had told her, one night in the winter with the lamp low and the snow against the windows, that he had not understood what it meant to be at home until he was here, on this farm, with her. They added on to the house through November and December. Theodore and Josiah Webb and Emilio raised together, building a second bedroom onto the east side of the farmhouse with good timber and careful joinery. Martha kept them supplied with coffee and food, and occasionally appeared in the doorway with an opinion about the window placement that was received with the respectful seriousness it deserved. The room was finished by Christmas, solid and warm, with a window that looked out toward the horizon in a way Martha said was correct. Their son was born in April of 1881, in the farmhouse, with the midwife from Calico Creek attending and Theodore present in a way that was not customary, but that Martha had simply stated was her expectation, and that Theodore had not once considered declining. He was there, solid and steady, when she needed it, and afterward he held the baby with the care of a man who understands precisely what he is holding. They named him James Robert Maddox. James for Theodore's father, the diminished man who had not lived to see this, and Robert for the man who had built this farm and loved it, and whose goodness Martha would not erase or forget. Martha held the baby in the days after the birth and watched Theodore moving through the house and the farm with the particular quality of purpose that had always been his, but changed now, deepened, directed not only by tasks to be done, but by the knowledge of what the tasks were for. He chopped wood with the winter still in the early morning air, and she watched from the window and thought about how things arrive, how the important things come not through planning, but through the willingness to be present when they do. James Robert Maddox was a loud, determined baby who ate enthusiastically and slept unpredictably, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's direct, assessing gaze, and he was adored by both of them with a depth that neither of them discussed at length, because it was too large for easy words. By summer he was sitting up in the basket Martha placed in the shade near the garden while she worked, watching the world with those serious dark eyes, and Theodore would come in from the fields at midday and crouch down to the baby's level, and say things to him with great seriousness, as though conducting a necessary conversation. And Martha would watch this from the garden and feel something in her chest that was so large and warm it was almost difficult to contain. Eliza Perkins came to visit in June and sat at the kitchen table with coffee and held the baby and said, "I am sorry I was afraid to tell you about the warrant earlier." Martha looked at her. "You told me when you thought it was necessary," she said. "That is what you were able to do. I do not hold it against you." "I was frightened of Vance," Eliza said. "We were all frightened of Vance for a long time, more than we admitted." "Fear does that," Martha said. "It is not a character flaw. It is the price of living in places where power is unevenly distributed." Eliza looked at her with something like recognition. "You have always seen things clearly," she said. "I try," Martha said. "I do not always succeed." "You were one of the only ones who stood up to him," Eliza said. Martha thought about this honestly. "I was not brave," she said. "I was furious and I had help." Fury and assistance can look like bravery from the outside. Eliza smiled. "I will take it," she said. Theodore came in from the field and poured himself water and looked at his son in Eliza's arms and said, He is looking more like Martha every day, which was a statement about the baby's expression rather than his features, since the eyes were unmistakably Theodore's. He has your stubbornness, Martha said. He has your stubbornness, Theodore said. I am simply decisive. That is a very generous description of stubbornness, she said. Eliza laughed and the baby startled and then looked around with that searching gaze for the source of the interesting noise. And it was a beautiful, ordinary moment, the kind that constitute a life when you are not paying dramatic attention to it. The second letter from Samuel Trent arrived in August of 1881, and this one addressed something they had not expected. Trent had been in contact, through the federal proceedings, with a land rights organization in Washington that was working to formalize the restoration of properties taken through fraudulent means under the Homestead Act. Martha's property had come to their attention as an example of a homestead that had successfully resisted this kind of pressure, and there was a possibility, Trent wrote carefully, of a modest financial settlement from the Vance receivership to compensate for the legal costs and distress of the 2-year campaign. They read the letter together at the kitchen table, the baby asleep in his cradle nearby, the August afternoon coming through the windows. "We do not need the money," Theodore said. "Not urgently." "I know," Martha said, "but I think we should accept it." She looked at him. "Not for us, for the farm. I want to build a proper root cellar and replace the barn roof before it becomes critical and put in a larger kitchen garden fence. Those things are for the farm's future." He nodded slowly. "And for James," he said. "And for James," she agreed. "And for whoever else comes along." He looked at her sideways. "Is there something you want to tell me?" She looked back at him with her clearest, most direct expression. "Not yet," she said. "I'm merely speaking generally about the future." He looked unconvinced, but wisely did not press. She told him in September. She had been right, she said, when she had spoken generally about the future. He laughed and kissed her with a warmth that made James, watching from his blanket on the floor, wave his arms in a way that seemed approving. The money from the Vance settlement arrived in November, and they spent it exactly as Martha had planned. The root cellar first because it was the most practical, then the barn roof because Theodore had been watching it with professional concern for months, and she trusted his assessment of structural things entirely. And then the kitchen garden fence, which was built large and solid and true, and which was, Martha said, the best fence she had ever had. Theodore laughed when she said this, and she looked at him and said, "What?" "The first fence I fixed," he said. "That was not the best fence you had ever had." "It was very good," she said with great dignity. "But this one has a better gate latch." He shook his head, still smiling, and drove in the last post with a clean stroke of the mallet. Their daughter was born in July of 1882. They named her Frances Clara. Frances for Theodore's grandmother, whose kitchen garden had been a living map, and Clara for the widow in Calico Creek, who had lost her land and rebuilt from nothing, and whose eyes, when she saw Martha with Theodore, and the baby, said everything that needed saying about hope. Frances was smaller than James had been and louder in a different register, and she had her mother's coloring and her father's steadiness, and she arrived in the farmhouse like a small, emphatic declaration of something that did not need to be translated. Theodore held her on the first evening of her life, while Martha slept finally, after the long labor, and he sat in the chair by the window with the summer dark outside and the lamp very low, and he looked at his daughter's face with that expression of his that was beyond his capacity to contain, and the farm was quiet around him. The cattle settled, the fields breathing in their summer fullness, and he thought about the long road that had led here, the losses and the running and the years of purposeless motion. And how none of the worst of it had anticipated this. This farmhouse, this woman asleep in the next room, this boy who examined the world with those serious dark eyes. This new small face. Martha found him there when she woke in the middle of the night, still sitting in the chair with the baby, both of them awake, regarding each other with great seriousness. "Come to bed," she said from the doorway, "both of you." He looked up at her with that expression she loved, the one that was warmth and steadiness and something that had no other word than home. "We were talking," he said. "She is 3 hours old," Martha said. "She does not yet have a great deal to contribute." "She has opinions," he said. "I can tell." Martha looked at her daughter. She had opinions too, from what she could see. "Bring her," she said. "You can talk in the morning." He stood carefully and followed her, and they settled in the wide farmhouse bed with Frances between them. And outside, the summer night moved over the Kansas plains in all its vast and quiet dark, and the farm breathed around them, the fixed and sturdy and well-maintained farm. And Martha lay in the lamplight looking at her daughter, and then at her husband, and she thought about the morning 3 years ago when she had looked up from mending the garden fence and seen a rider coming from the west. "Theodore," she said softly. He looked across the baby at her. "Martha," he said. "I am glad you fixed the fence," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear everything he felt, the deep and particular gladness of it, the improbable arc from that lonely morning to this. "So am I," he said, "more than I can say." "Then do not try to say it," she said. "Just stay." He reached across the sleeping baby and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his back, and the lamp burned low and the prairie was quiet, and the farm held its ground, solid and warm, the way things hold their ground when they are built well and tended to and loved. James discovered in the morning that he had a sister and declared, after a thorough inspection, that she was adequate. Theodore told him that was a word that meant good, and James looked satisfied and went to eat his breakfast. And Martha laughed, the real and full laugh that had always come easier than she had expected here, easier than she had known a laugh could come. And Theodore smiled watching her, and Frances slept through all of it with the complete composure of someone who had arrived in a place that was already, unquestionably, her home. That autumn Theodore rode out to the western boundary of the farm, where the fence line met the old Vance property, which was now being managed by a land agent appointed by the federal court. He measured the boundary. He confirmed that it was correct. He came home and told Martha that the fence line was where it was supposed to be, and that the land was where it was supposed to be, and that nobody was going to take any of it. She nodded, not with relief exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a thing confirmed that she had already known. "Good," she said. "Supper is ready." He washed his hands at the pump that worked smooth and easy now, and he came in and sat at the table where James was already seated with his hands in his lap, as he had been taught, and Frances was in her cradle making the small sounds she made when she was awake and considering her opinions. And Martha brought the food to the table and sat down, and they said grace in the simple, quiet way they had developed. Not an elaborate prayer, but a brief acknowledgement, a moment of gratitude for what was here. And what was here was everything. The farm with its mended fences and its solid barn and its root cellar stocked for winter. The children who were healthy and watched the world with clear and attentive eyes. The table that had once been too large and too quiet and was now neither. The man across from her who had come from the west on a trail-dusty horse, with a secret he had not yet told and fixed her fence without being asked, and who had stayed and built something with her, and who looked at her every day with the expression that said she was known and seen and chosen. The winter came hard that year, but they were prepared for it, and they worked through it as they always did together, with the practiced efficiency and the easy communication of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and trusted each other's judgment. James learned his letters by the fire, and Frances began to pull herself up on the furniture and regard the room with a proprietary air. And Theodore read to them in the evenings from the books on the shelf, and Martha mended and planned the spring planting, and sometimes just sat and listened to his voice in the lamplight and thought how strange and how good it was, how the most important things rarely arrived the way you imagined them. In the spring of 1883, a letter came from Missouri. It was from Theodore's uncle, a man named Henry Maddox, who had heard through distant channels that the warrant had been vacated and that his nephew was alive and married and in Kansas. The letter was brief and somewhat formal in the way of men who had not spoken in many years and were finding their way back toward each other, but it was warm beneath the formality and it extended an invitation. Theodore read it twice and then handed it to Martha without speaking. She read it. She looked up at him. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "I do not know," he said honestly. "The farm can manage a visit," she said. "Emilio has offered before to keep an eye on things. We could take the children." He looked at her steadily. "You would do that?" "I would do that," she said. "Missouri is not the moon. The stage goes to Wichita and there is rail east from there. And I think," she paused carefully, "I think you should let yourself go back, not to stay, but to go back and know that it is the past and that you have a present that is real and solid and yours." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did you get so wise?" he said. "I have always been this wise," she said. "You are simply recently acquainted with it." He smiled, the full warm smile that had taken so long to arrive and that she still found every time the most welcome thing she knew. "All right," he said. "Let us take the children to Missouri." They went in June, when the farm could spare them. It was James's first train ride, and he regarded the locomotive with the same intense assessment he brought to everything. And Francis fell asleep against Martha's shoulder, and did not wake until they crossed into Missouri, and the landscape changed from plains to the green rolling hills that were so different from what she knew. Theodore was quiet through much of the journey in a way Martha recognized as internal, as processing, as the deep work a person does when they are approaching something they have carried for a long time. She sat beside him and let him be quiet, and when he reached for her hand she gave it to him, and when he looked at her she looked back with the clear and steady gaze that she knew he found settling. Henry Maddox was a small, weathered man in his 60s who looked at Theodore with eyes that filled immediately and said nothing for a moment and then said, "You look like your father," in a voice that was controlled with effort. Theodore said, "I know." And then they embraced, and Martha stood back and held Francis and watched, and James stood beside her and watched too with his solemn eyes. They stayed 4 days. They visited the site where the house had been, which was now a different house belonging to different people, and Theodore stood at the edge of the property and looked at it for a long time, and Martha stood beside him. She did not speak. She let him look. "It is only a house," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "and also more than that, both things are true." He looked at her. "What is the home that matters is in Kansas," he said. She felt the warmth of that settle through her. "Yes," she said, "it is." They went home to Kansas on a Thursday in June, arriving on the late stage from Wichita, and Emilio met them at the Calico Creek station and said everything was in fine order and that the milk cow had had a calf while they were gone. James immediately wanted to see the calf, and the conversation shifted into the practical and immediate present in the way it always did, and Martha looked at Theodore as they loaded the wagon and caught his eye, and they shared one of those quick, private looks that meant everything between them. The farm was exactly as they had left it. The fences stood straight and tight. The house was cool and dark in the evening warmth, and smelled of the dried lavender Martha kept in the rooms. The stars were coming out over the plains in that particular extravagance that was nothing like the Missouri sky, wide and western and enormous. They put the children to bed and sat on the porch in the familiar posture of two people who have sat in this place so many times it has the quality of ceremony, and the prairie night opened up around them with its coyotes in the distance and its insects and its vast, companionable dark. "We are home," Theodore said. "We are home," she said. He took her hand. She held his. The farm breathed around them, the fixed and tended and well-loved farm that had started with a fence and a stranger coming from the west, and that was now a life so full and particular, and there's that Martha Kingsley, who had trained herself not to want things too openly for fear of how much it cost when they were taken, allowed herself to want it completely, to hold it without bracing for its loss, to say yes, this is the thing. Theodore Maddox, who had been moving for 15 years, was still. And in the stillness was everything,